The town of Brookhaven was the kind of place where life moved slowly, tucked away in the quiet folds of suburban America. Families knew each other, neighbors waved as they mowed their lawns, and children biked through the streets until the evening sun dipped behind the horizon. It was the sort of town where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. That was precisely why the events of one crisp autumn morning would leave everyone in shock, carving a scar on the community that would never fully heal. At the center of this story was David Miller, a 42-year-old father of two. To those who knew him, David was the embodiment of responsibility. He worked as a financial consultant, but his true devotion was to his family. His wife, Emily, described him as dependable, kind, and the type of person who never missed his son's baseball games or his daughter's school recitals. Friends knew him as a man of quiet humor, someone who preferred the comfort of his own home to crowded social gatherings. Every morning, David followed the same ritual. He would rise before dawn, lace up his running shoes, and head out for his jog. Jogging wasn't just exercise for David. It was his form of meditation, his way of clearing his mind before the chaos of the day began. He enjoyed the silence of the streets before most of the town was awake, the crunch of gravel under his shoes, the cool air filling his lungs. It was a routine that Emily never worried about. Brookhaven was safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. That particular morning, the air was colder than usual, the first hints of fall settling into the small town. Leaves littered the sidewalks, painting the ground in shades of orange and red. David tied his shoelaces tightly, kissed Emily on the cheek, and whispered that he'd be back in an hour. She barely stirred. This had been his routine for years. Neither of them could have imagined it would be the last time she'd hear his voice. As David jogged through the streets, the town was eerily quiet. The streetlights buzzed faintly, and the occasional dog bark echoed from a distant yard. Passing through his usual route, he waved at the paperboy who pedaled past, one of the few other souls awake at that hour. Everything felt normal, but normality, as it turned out, was only an illusion. By 7:15 a.m., Emily began to grow concerned. David always returned home on time, showered, and sat with the kids before they left for school. But this morning, the clock ticked past his usual arrival, and the kitchen table sat empty. She tried to tell herself he had simply taken a longer route, but a gnawing sense of unease began to build in her chest. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still no sign of David. Emily picked up her phone and dialed his number, only to hear it ring endlessly before going to voicemail. She texted him, "Are you okay? Where are you?" No reply. Her unease deepened into panic. By 8:30 a.m., Emily was calling friends, then the local police station. Officers assured her that sometimes joggers took detours or injured themselves and were delayed. But as the day wore on and David never returned, the tone shifted from reassurance to concern. Word spread quickly in a town as small as Brookhaven. By noon, neighbors were knocking on Emily's door, offering to help search. The streets, once so ordinary, now seemed filled with tension. People whispered theories in hushed tones. Maybe David had collapsed, maybe he'd been hit by a car, maybe he'd wandered too far into the woods. But as hours turned into night, darker possibilities began to take hold. Police began their initial search that afternoon, retracing David's usual jogging route. His neighbors joined in, walking along the sidewalks and wooded trails. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a broken phone, not a single clue to suggest where he had gone. It was as if David had simply vanished into thin air. For Emily, the silence was unbearable. The house, once filled with the laughter of her children and the steady presence of her husband, now echoed with fear. She sat by the window, clutching her phone, waiting for a call that never came. In her heart, she felt something she didn't dare say aloud, that David's disappearance wasn't an accident. Something had happened on that morning jog, something no one could explain. The sun set, and with it, the sense of safety Brookhaven had always clung to. Doors that once remained unlocked were bolted shut. Parents warned their children not to play outside alone. And Emily, sitting alone in her quiet home, whispered the words that would haunt her for years to come. He went for a jog, and he never came back. They didn't know it yet, but the search for David Miller was only the beginning. The truth, what the police would eventually uncover, would shock everyone, unraveling the illusion of peace in Brookhaven and leaving behind questions that would linger for decades. The morning of his disappearance began like any other, quiet and deceptively ordinary. It was late spring when the sun still rose gently over the horizon, painting the sky in pastel shades of orange and pink before the heat of the day took over. The small suburban neighborhood where the Carter family lived was barely stirring at that hour. The houses stood in neat rows, driveways lined with cars, and trees that swayed lightly with the morning breeze. For most, the day had not yet begun. For one man, however, this was the time he felt most alive. Michael Carter, 42 years old, father of two, husband, neighbor, and friend, laced up his running shoes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Running had been his ritual, his personal sanctuary. No matter what weighed on him, stress from work, the chaos of family life, or simply the noise of the modern world, those early jogs gave him clarity. His wife, Anna, sometimes teased him, saying he treated his morning runs the way monks treated meditation. But she also admired his discipline. He was always up before the alarm, quietly moving through the house so as not to wake the kids, stretching in the living room, sipping a small glass of water before heading out into the dawn. That morning was no different, or so it seemed. Anna later remembered hearing him softly closing the front door, a faint creak followed by silence. She rolled over in bed, half asleep, reassured by the sound. The children, 8-year-old Sophie and 10-year-old Daniel, were still sound asleep in their rooms, their breathing deep and steady. Everything about the house radiated peace. Nothing foreshadowed the storm that was about to enter their lives. Michael's usual route was familiar, almost instinctive. He would jog down Willow Lane, turn toward the small park about a mile away, circle the trail that ran beside a shallow creek, then loop back home. It usually took him about 45 minutes, depending on his pace. The neighbors often spotted him during these runs, sometimes waving, sometimes joining for a brief jog before peeling off. He was known for his friendly nods, his calm demeanor, his steady rhythm on the pavement. But that morning something was subtly different. The air was unusually cool, almost biting for late spring, and a heavy mist hung low to the ground. Streetlights flickered faintly, struggling against the gray haze. The silence was thicker than usual. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Michael noticed it but dismissed it. He had always believed nature had its moods, just like people. It's just one of those mornings, he might have thought as he adjusted his headphones and set his pace. A jogger thrives on routine, and Michael was no exception. The repetition gave him comfort. Step, breath, step, breath. Yet, while he moved through the familiar streets, there were details he couldn't ignore. A parked car sat idling at the far corner of Willow Lane, its headlights off. He glanced at it briefly, then looked away, deciding it wasn't worth his concern. A dog barked furiously behind a neighbor's fence, its tone sharp and restless, louder than usual. He quickened his pace. Back at home, Anna brewed coffee, glancing at the kitchen clock. She wasn't worried. Michael had never been the type to slack off or abandon his run midway. If anything, she admired his predictability. Still, she remembered feeling a slight, inexplicable unease, one she later couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the mist, or the silence, or the way her cat paced near the back door that morning, staring into the fog with its ears pinned back. At the time, it felt like nothing. Later, it felt like everything. By the time Michael reached the park trail, the mist had thickened. The narrow dirt path wound along the creek, the sound of running water muffled beneath the blanket of fog. He passed the old wooden bench where he usually stretched halfway through his run, but this time he didn't stop. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. He slowed briefly, listening. The world was eerily still. No cars on the nearby road, no laughter from children who sometimes came early to play, not even the usual chatter of morning birds. Just silence. He shook it off and kept running, pushing himself harder. Sweat trickled down his temples despite the cold air. His breathing grew heavier, echoing in his ears. For a moment he allowed himself to focus only on the rhythm. Step, breath, step, breath. And then, something broke the pattern. It was faint, distant, but distinct. A crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. He stopped abruptly, pulling out one earbud. His heart raced faster than his jog demanded. He scanned the trees, the fog swallowing most of the view. Probably a deer, he told himself. The woods often held wildlife, but even he knew it hadn't sounded quite right. The air was too still, the sound too deliberate. He waited another moment, then forced himself to move on. After all, he had a family waiting at home, a family who expected him back any minute now. Back at the house, Anna glanced again at the clock. 30 minutes had passed. She wasn't alarmed yet, but something tugged at her thoughts. Michael was punctual, always. She poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for him, leaving his on the counter the way she always did. She thought about how he would walk in, sweaty but smiling, making a joke about his old knees. The kids would wake up soon, the morning would unfold, and life would continue. That was the expectation. But outside, in the mist-shrouded park, expectation was about to shatter. The sun had begun to rise higher, but the fog refused to lift. As Michael jogged deeper into the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His pace slowed again, hesitation creeping into his movements. Somewhere behind him, or perhaps beside him, it was impossible to tell through the mist, he thought he heard footsteps. Steady, measured, following. He turned sharply, scanning the trail. Nothing. Just the endless haze. Michael Carter adjusted his earbuds again, forced a laugh under his breath, and tried to convince himself it was his imagination. But deep down, he knew. He wasn't alone on that trail. The park trail curved deeper into the wooded area, where the trees grew taller, and the canopy blocked out much of the weak morning light. The mist clung stubbornly to the ground, curling like smoke between roots and rocks. Michael Carter slowed his pace, his breath coming in steady bursts, but the unease gnawed at him with every step. He had jogged this path countless times. He knew the bends, the bridges, the wooden signs warning hikers not to stray too far from the trail. Yet that morning, the familiar route felt strangely foreign, as though he were trespassing in a place that no longer welcomed him. He tried to shake the thought. "Just another run," he whispered under his breath, his voice sounding too loud in the silence. He wished he hadn't taken out his earbuds earlier. Music would have drowned out the tension pressing against his mind. But something about the fog kept him from putting them back in. He needed to listen. And then, there it was again. The sound. Not the steady rhythm of his own footsteps, but something else. A faint shuffle, a displacement of gravel on the path behind him. He spun around quickly, his chest tightening. Nothing. The trail behind him stretched into the mist, empty and gray. Michael exhaled sharply, trying to calm himself. He told himself it was probably an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a fox. But animals didn't usually follow joggers. They scattered at the first sign of human presence. Whatever the noise was, it seemed intentional, deliberate. Continuing forward, Michael quickened his pace. The mist seemed to thicken with every step until he could barely see a few yards ahead. That was when he spotted something unusual. A A figure. For a moment he froze, squinting. It was faint, more of a silhouette than a person, standing at the curve of the path. Tall, motionless, partly swallowed by fog. Michael blinked, and just like that, it was gone. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might drown out the silence. He forced a nervous laugh. Imagination, he muttered. Too much coffee. But deep inside, he wasn't convinced. The trail led him to a small clearing near the creek, where the water trickled quietly over stones. Here, he often paused to drink from his water bottle, to catch his breath. Today, he didn't stop. The place felt wrong. The mist pooled heavily in the clearing, muffling even the sound of water. He noticed something else, fresh footprints in the damp soil along the bank. At first, he assumed they were his own from a previous jog, but as he leaned down, he realized they were too large, too deep, and they weren't alone. There were several sets, overlapping, circling, leading both toward the woods and back to the trail. Michael straightened abruptly, his pulse racing. He told himself the park was public. People walked here every day, but it was too early for that, too early for so many prints. He hadn't seen another jogger, another walker, anyone at all since leaving his house. Behind him, a twig snapped. This time, he didn't spin around. He simply ran. The pace of his jog became a sprint, his shoes pounding the ground as he tried to outrun the suffocating fog. He pushed himself harder, lungs burning, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every rustle of leaves, every scrape of gravel seemed amplified, echoing in his mind like whispers. The woods had turned into a cage, closing in tighter with each passing second. When he finally reached the wooden bridge that crossed the creek, he stopped again, gasping for air. The bridge groaned under his weight as he leaned against the railing. He forced himself to look back down the trail. Nothing, just endless mist. His hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "Get it together," he muttered. "You're fine. You're fine." But he wasn't. Michael thought about turning back. His house wasn't far. If he ran fast enough, he'd be home in 10 minutes. Anna would be making breakfast. The kids would be waking up. The thought gave him strength. He adjusted his pace, ready to head back. That was when he heard it. A voice. Faint, almost swallowed by the fog, but unmistakable. It wasn't a word he could identify, just a sound, low and drawn out, like someone calling from far away. His skin prickled. He stood frozen on the bridge, straining to hear. Seconds passed. Silence. Then it came again, closer this time. Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to shout, to demand who was there, but fear gripped him too tightly. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He ran. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the fog thicker, the silence more suffocating. Every few steps he swore he heard footsteps behind him, matching his pace, speeding up when he did, slowing when he faltered. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was impossible, that he was imagining things, but the instinct for survival drowned it out. He pushed harder, muscles screaming, lungs burning, sweat stinging his eyes. As he finally broke free of the wooded trail and reached the edge of the park, he allowed himself a fleeting sense of relief. The houses were just ahead, their roofs faintly visible through the mist. Safety was near. But when he turned one last time, he saw it again. The figure, standing at the edge of the trail, half shrouded in fog, unmoving, watching. Michael Carter blinked, and the figure dissolved into the mist. But the terror it left behind remained, heavy and suffocating. Back at home, Anna glanced at the clock again. It was nearly an hour since Michael had left. His coffee sat untouched on the counter, growing cold. She frowned, picking up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing his number. The call rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. Anna set the phone down, telling herself not to worry, but deep inside, a chill spread through her chest. Something wasn't right. And on the trail, somewhere between the fog and the trees, Michael Carter had already crossed the invisible line between routine and nightmare. The neighborhood had begun to stir awake as Anna Carter stood at the kitchen window, phone in hand, staring out at the fog that hadn't yet lifted. It was nearly 8 in the morning, and Michael still hadn't returned. She dialed his number again, her fingers trembling slightly, but the call went unanswered. The pit in her stomach grew heavier. At first, she tried to reassure herself. He had probably run into a neighbor, stopped for a chat. Maybe he decided to push himself with a longer route. But Michael was nothing if not predictable. His morning jogs followed the same rhythm, down to the minute. He had never once come home this late without explanation. By the time she set down her phone, her unease had become unbearable. She pulled on a jacket and stepped outside, scanning the empty street. The mist hung low, swallowing the edges of the houses, muting the usual sounds of dogs barking and kids chattering on their way to school. She thought about calling the police but hesitated. What would she say? That her husband was half an hour late from a jog? That the fog felt too heavy, the silence too deep? They'd tell her to wait. So she waited. But waiting did nothing to soothe the dread. Meanwhile, out on the trail, Michael was still running, or rather, stumbling. His sprint had slowed to a desperate jog, and then to cautious steps. The figure he'd seen. It couldn't have been real, he told himself. He was exhausted, lightheaded. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on his eyes. Yet he couldn't shake the sound of that voice. As he reached the small wooden bench near the trail's midpoint, he collapsed onto it, gripping the edge to steady his shaking hands. The world tilted slightly. He pressed his palms against his eyes, willing himself to focus. He needed to get home. Anna was waiting. The kids. He couldn't sit here losing his mind, but when he lowered his hands, something caught his eye, a backpack. It lay abandoned just a few feet from the bench, half concealed by wet leaves. Michael frowned. He didn't remember seeing it earlier. Slowly, he rose to his feet and approached. The bag was old, frayed at the edges, but what unsettled him was its contents. The zipper was partially open, and inside he glimpsed a child's toy, a small, dirt-stained teddy bear. Michael froze, a chill crawling down his spine. What was a toy doing here, in the middle of the trail? The park wasn't deserted. Families came here in the summer, but not this early in the season, not in the thick of fog. He crouched down, reaching toward the bag, when he heard it again. A rustle. This time it was closer, right behind him. Michael whipped around, but the trail was empty. Empty, yet not silent. He could hear the faint crunch of footsteps retreating into the mist just beyond his sight. Someone, or something, was out there, watching, testing him. His chest tightened. He backed away from the bag, every instinct screaming at him to leave it alone. He forced himself back onto the trail, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, heart hammering. The woods, once his sanctuary, had transformed into a nightmare labyrinth. Then came the worst part. As Michael approached the fork in the trail, he noticed something odd on the ground. At first glance, it looked like mud smeared across the wooden signpost, but as he stepped closer, his stomach lurched. It wasn't mud. It was red, dark, sticky. His breath caught in his throat. Blood. His mind spiraled. An injured animal? Maybe. But the streak was too deliberate, smeared as though by a hand. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming. The fog seemed to press in tighter, suffocating. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body felt paralyzed. He forced his legs into motion, stumbling down the main path, desperate to get out of the park. And that was when he realized something even more terrifying. His watch. Michael glanced at his wrist, hoping to ground himself, to check the time. But the screen was black, dead. He tapped it, pressed the button. Nothing. His phone, too. He pulled it from his pocket, but it refused to turn on. Just hours ago, both had been fully charged. Panic surged through him. He was cut off, alone. The fog, the silence, the strange figures. Now he couldn't even call for help, couldn't even confirm the time. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and ran again, this time fueled by sheer survival instinct. But the trails seemed different now. Wrong. He should have reached the exit by now. He knew this park. He'd run it for years. Yet every turn looked unfamiliar, every landmark swallowed by the mist. He was lost. Then, faintly, he heard it again. The voice. This time it was unmistakable. A whisper, drawn out, almost mocking. It seemed to slither through the trees, crawling into his ears. Michael. He froze. His blood turned cold. That wasn't possible. He hadn't told anyone he'd be here. No one knew his route. No one but Anna. And the voice, it wasn't hers. Michael staggered back, colliding with a tree. His breath came in short, frantic gasps, his vision blurred with tears of fear. He turned and ran blindly, branches tearing at his arms, shoes slipping on wet leaves. He didn't care where he went. He just needed to get away. Back at home, Anna couldn't take it anymore. She dialed the police. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation, her instincts screaming louder than logic. "Something's wrong," she insisted. "He should have been back an hour ago. Please, you have to send someone." The dispatcher tried to reassure her, promising they'd look into it. But even as she hung up, Anna knew. Something had happened. And deep in the fog-covered woods, Michael Carter realized the same thing. He wasn't going home. Not today. Maybe not ever. The morning after that terrible night arrived heavy and gray. A relentless rain had begun in the early hours, drenching the ground into a slippery, chaotic mess. Tree branches sagged under the weight of the drops, and the nearby creek had swollen, flooding parts of the trail. The sun struggled to pierce the dense gray clouds, casting only a weak, muted light across the wet grass. Amid this dreary morning, the family stood on the clearing, surrounded by mist and rain. Their faces were pale, their movements tense with fear. Anna clutched the children close, hugging them as tightly as she could, as if proximity could shield them from something lurking just beyond sight. Michael, disoriented and exhausted from the night, tried to maintain a calm exterior, but his heart raced violently. He knew they could not stay in one place. The campsite was no longer safe. They decided to move toward the main road, hoping to encounter another person or a passing car. But nature seemed determined to block them. Trails had turned into muddy rivers, and a sudden gust of wind forced them to bend low, fighting to keep balance on the slick, unstable ground. Every step required careful calculation, and often they had to risk plunging through dense underbrush that snagged their clothing and left scratches on their arms. The children cried, but softly, careful not to make noise that might draw attention from the unseen presence stalking them through the mist. Anna held their hands tightly, feeling her own fingers growing numb from the cold, realizing with growing dread that the further they went, the smaller the chance of finding civilization. After a few hundred meters, they reached a broken footbridge crossing a small, swollen stream. Water roared beneath the wooden planks, threatening to sweep away any misstep. Michael tested each step carefully, guiding the children across. His heart pounded painfully against his chest. Then he saw it, the first evidence of another presence. Fresh footprints pressed deeply into the soft, wet soil, large, deliberate, moving toward the woods from which they had come. "Someone's been here," Michael whispered, but the heavy rain drowned out his voice. Anna felt her chest tighten with terror. She knew these were no ordinary animal tracks. Someone had been watching them, and that invisible presence was far closer than they had imagined. They pressed on, hoping to find a road, but the trails twisted and turned like a maze. Trees, twisted by wind and rain, seemed to form barriers, and the mist thickened with every step, obscuring familiar landmarks. Exhausted and frightened, the children stumbled repeatedly, and Anna desperately lifted them from the mud, urging them to keep moving. Michael forced a calm facade, but inside, raw fear gnawed at him. And then the first disappearance occurred. The youngest child tripped, calling out, "Mom!" Anna turned and her heart stopped. The girl was gone. The mist swallowed her small form, leaving only an echo of her scream behind. Michael sprinted back, scanning the area frantically, but there was no trace, no footprints, no fall, no sign she had ever been there. It was as if the fog itself had claimed her. Panic took over instantly. Anna screamed, and Michael dashed forward and backward, searching for the girl through the wet grass and dense haze. The rain hammered their faces, the mud pulled at their feet, but they could not stop. And then they felt the invisible weight of something else, the mist itself as if breathing around them, diverting their vision, hiding objects, making navigation impossible. After what felt like an eternity without success, Michael realized the terrifying truth. They were losing time. Every minute in this suffocating void could cost them everything. They did not know where the rest of their group was, if anyone was nearby, or even if someone was watching. Anna felt utterly helpless, realizing her voice was just a faint sound, lost in the heart of a hostile, living forest. They decided to keep moving, searching for a road, hoping for people or a vehicle. But the forest seemed to shift around them, every turn and tree consumed by mist, every familiar landmark transformed into an alien obstacle. Water splashed in puddles, branches cracked underfoot, and with every step they understood that they were playing by rules known only to the unseen observer. Then Michael stopped. He felt it, that indescribable sensation, not just fear, but an absolute void, pulling at every nerve. His heart raced, his mind blurred between reality and nightmare. Anna grabbed his hand, whispering, "We have to stay together." But there was no response, only the thick mist and the rustling sound of movement, advancing and retreating at the same time. The last thing they saw before being completely swallowed by the forest was a shadow flashing between the trees, and the faint echo of a child's scream, cut abruptly in mid-sentence. And then, nothing. From that day forward, no one ever saw them again. The forest, rain, and mist swallowed their tracks, and what had once been a familiar, safe place became a symbol of terror and unexplained disappearance. The morning after the disappearance of the Carter family had turned into a nightmare that gripped the town. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, damp fog that clung stubbornly to the ground, but the sense of dread lingered in the air. Local authorities had been alerted by Anna's frantic call, and soon the town's police officers arrived at the scene, their faces drawn with concern. Officer Reynolds, a seasoned veteran who had patrolled the area for over 20 years, surveyed the muddy trails with narrowed eyes. He had seen his share of accidents, missing persons, and even the occasional criminal. But something about this case felt different. The trails looked as if they had been erased by nature, footprints obliterated, familiar markers hidden by fog and wet leaves. "We'll need volunteers," Reynolds said, addressing the officers and a small group of locals who had gathered, anxious and shaken. "We'll divide into teams. Every trail, every creek, every clearing will be checked." Within the hour, groups were formed. Each carried flashlights, umbrellas, and walkie-talkies. Some had dogs trained for tracking. Others carried metal detectors and simple probing sticks to search the underbrush. Maps of the park and surrounding areas were spread on the hoods of police cars, marking where the family had last been seen and where the fog had been thickest. The first hours were maddening. The teams combed the muddy trails, calling out names, scanning the dense foliage, and listening for any sound of movement. But the forest seemed to swallow every noise, every footprint, every sign of life. The dogs, normally reliable trackers, grew agitated, whining and snapping at the mist as if sensing something invisible. Even they refused to move deeper into the woods. By mid-morning, some first clues began to appear. A half-buried backpack, waterlogged and smeared with mud, was discovered near a gnarled tree. Its contents were scattered: a few soaked snacks, a torn notebook, and one of the children's jackets. The small items were enough to confirm the team was in the right area, but they also intensified the unease. No footprints led away from the backpack. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the family whole. Later, deeper into the trail, a local hiker stumbled upon a small, strange carving on a tree trunk. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. A circle, etched deep, with lines radiating outward like some kind of ancient symbol. Officers examined it, photographing and documenting every detail. Nobody recognized the design, but the very presence of something so deliberate unsettled the searchers. Had someone or something been waiting in the woods? As the day wore on, frustration began to creep in. Volunteers grew exhausted, shivering in the damp chill. Flashlights cut through the fog. The morning after the disappearance brought a different kind of storm, a storm of questions, worry, and urgency. Brookhaven, a town that had always prided itself on calm streets and predictable routines, suddenly found itself gripped by fear. The news spread faster than the rain soaking the roads. Michael Carter, Anna, and their children had vanished without a trace. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, staring nervously at the mist-laden forest that had swallowed the family. Authorities were notified immediately, and within hours the first search teams were assembled. By 8 a.m., the local police had cordoned off the area surrounding the park trail. Officers moved methodically, walking in pairs, flashlights in hand, despite the weak light of the overcast sky. The first challenge was the terrain itself. Heavy rain had transformed familiar dirt paths into mud-laden traps. Fallen branches blocked some of the narrower trails, while the creek, swollen by the storm, had overflowed in places, forcing searchers to find alternate routes. The police brought in tracking dogs, their noses low to the ground, ears perked, ready to detect the faintest human scent. Each handler guided their dog along the trails where Michael and his family had been seen last. The dogs stopped abruptly at times, noses twitching, then pulled insistently in one direction, only to be led astray by the shifting water and thick fog. Footprints left in the mud provided little help. Rain had already washed away the finer details, leaving only distorted impressions that were difficult to interpret. By midday, volunteers from the town had arrived in small groups. They carried umbrellas, raincoats, and lanterns, forming lines along the forest edges and spreading into the trails. Parents called out, searching for children. Hikers retraced paths. Even teenagers joined in, motivated by a mix of curiosity and the need to help. The sense of community was strong, but so was the creeping anxiety. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig underfoot made hearts jump. Some volunteers swore they saw fleeting shadows at the edge of the mist, but others dismissed these sightings as tricks of light and imagination. Authorities coordinated via radio, setting up checkpoints at every entrance and exit to the forest. Helicopters were deployed, hovering over the canopy, their spotlights slicing through the thick fog in search of any movement. From above, the forest looked like a gray, textured ocean, waves of mist hiding its secrets. Despite the aerial view, no definitive trace of the family was found. Searchers on the ground scoured the trails repeatedly, calling out names, following instinct and the faintest clues. Around mid-afternoon, the first tangible evidence appeared. A volunteer discovered a small backpack partially hidden in the mud near the creek. The zipper was torn, the contents scattered, a few wet clothes, a half-empty water bottle, and a child's toy, dirt-streaked and soaked through. The police collected it carefully, cataloging every item. They found no identifying documents, no clear indication of who had left the bag. Other discoveries followed. A trail of prints, much larger than any adult's shoe size, led into the forest and abruptly stopped. The searchers scoured the surrounding area but found nothing further. Some officers reported seeing symbols scratched into tree bark along the trails, odd geometric shapes, circles intersected by lines, nothing they could recognize from any known code or marking system. The symbols were fresh, the bark still moist, but whether they were connected to the disappearance or not was unclear. As hours stretched into evening, the forest yielded few answers. The dogs, exhausted and confused by the washed-out scents, refused to follow most trails. Searchers, drenched and tired, returned to base with faces pale and grim. The sense of frustration and helplessness grew. Each new discovery, abandoned backpacks, muddy prints, strange symbols, only deepened the mystery. Officers and volunteers alike whispered theories, trying to make sense of the inexplicable, but every explanation seemed to collapse under scrutiny. The local authorities eventually called in a state-level investigation unit. Experienced detectives and forensic specialists examined the area, taking soil samples, photographing symbols, and measuring footprints. They interviewed neighbors who had last seen the family, reconstructing the morning's events as precisely as possible. Yet even with meticulous effort, the puzzle remained incomplete. No clear path of escape or abduction could be identified. As night fell, the forest seemed to reclaim its secrets. Searchlights cut through the mist, revealing glimpses of empty trails and pools of muddy water. Volunteers returned to the town, drenched and silent, sharing rumors and fearful speculation. Despite the efforts, the family remained missing, and every question raised seemed to multiply, not diminish. Some townspeople began to speak of a curse, of spirits haunting the forest, of ancient forces at work. Others insisted on rational explanations, an accident, an unknown assailant, or a sudden flight into panic. Authorities, however, had no definitive answers. The case was carefully logged, evidence stored, and search records maintained. But as the first 24 hours passed without discovery, unease turned into dread. Brookhaven, a town that had never imagined tragedy so close to home, began to feel the weight of a chilling uncertainty. By the end of the first week, the search was scaled up. Additional personnel, including state police, K-9 units, and forensic experts, combed the surrounding forest and nearby roads. Helicopters conducted grid searches, but the dense canopy and persistent fog limited visibility. Investigators studied the strange symbols again, consulting specialists in semiotics and obscure cultural markings, but no match was found. The phenomenon only deepened the mystery. News crews arrived, broadcasting the disappearance to a wider audience. Volunteers continued the ground searches despite the weather, motivated by the hope of finding a clue, a trace, anything. Yet the forest remained silent, the trails empty, the mystery impenetrable. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation continued, but with diminishing returns. Items of clothing, pieces of toys, and traces of footprints were catalogued, but no body, no definitive sign of life. The police began to recognize patterns that defied explanation. Objects disappearing from the forest as quickly as they were found, footprints leading nowhere, symbols appearing and vanishing. Brookhaven was gripped by a mixture of fear and fascination. The investigation, initially procedural, had turned into a story that could not be explained by logic alone. The authorities documented everything meticulously, but even seasoned detectives could not shake the feeling that something beyond ordinary comprehension was at play. And so, the case of the missing family entered a new phase, not only a search for the missing, but a search for understanding. Every footprint, every object, every symbol held a question. And the answers, it seemed, were waiting deep in the forest, where fog, rain, and shadows had already claimed more than just their tracks. Weeks passed, and Brookhaven struggled to return to normal. Yet the ordinary rhythms of the town were fractured, replaced by a low hum of speculation and fear. The disappearance of Michael Carter, Anna, and their children had left a void, not only in the forest where they had vanished, but in the hearts of the residents. Every conversation, every glance toward the trees bordering the park carried the weight of uncertainty. No one could shake the feeling that the forest itself had changed, becoming an ominous presence hovering on the edge of town. The first rumors began innocuously, whispered at the edges of grocery store aisles and over the counters of the local diner. One of the volunteers, a teenager who had helped in the early searches, claimed he had seen a figure moving through the mist. A tall silhouette, too still, too precise to be human. Another neighbor spoke of hearing faint laughter at night, carried on the wind, echoing from the direction of the forest. These stories spread like wildfire. People speculated that the family had somehow wandered into some unseen trap, that the forest itself had claimed them, or that some unknown force was at work. Soon, more imaginative versions began to take root. An elderly resident, Mrs. Callahan, whose family had lived in Brookhaven for generations, told anyone who would listen about the old legends surrounding the area. "The forest isn't just trees and streams," she warned. "It has eyes, it watches. There are tales of travelers who vanished without a trace, of whispers that lure people deep into the woods, and of spirits who guard something old, something dangerous." Her words, though treated skeptically by many, planted seeds of unease. Even the most rational citizens could not entirely dismiss them, particularly when faced with the inexplicable nature of the disappearance. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon Brookhaven's tragedy became a regional topic. Reporters interviewed neighbors, replayed footage from the initial search efforts, and described the eerie, mist-covered forest in vivid terms. The community's anxiety spread outward. The forest was no longer merely a background to suburban life. It had become a character in its own right, menacing and unknowable. On social media, hashtags circulated: Brookhaven disappearance, lost in the fog, and Outh Forest mystery. Every image of the damp trails and shadowed trees seemed to fuel speculation, and conspiracy theories began to form. Some argued rationally. Perhaps the family had tried to escape an unknown assailant, only to become disoriented in the storm. Maybe they had been abducted by a stranger, their bodies hidden beyond the reach of the initial search efforts. A few experts suggested that accidents, compounded by exhaustion, hypothermia, and panic, might have forced the family off the trail. Their explanations provided a measure of comfort, yet no physical evidence could confirm any version. Every hypothesis faced the same obstacle. The forest refused to yield concrete answers. Others leaned toward the supernatural. Stories began to emerge of people seeing fleeting shapes among the trees, tall figures, sometimes draped in darkness, moving with unnatural precision. There were tales of faint voices carried through the fog, whispers calling names that no one had spoken aloud. Some spoke of symbols etched into bark or stones, too intricate, too deliberate to be the work of natural causes. The accounts were inconsistent, fragmentary, yet compelling enough to convince a portion of the town that the disappearance was connected to something beyond human comprehension. Parents of the missing children faced the harshest scrutiny. Their friends and neighbors, desperate for answers, speculated endlessly. Could there have been a hidden threat in the community? Had someone followed the family into the forest? Or, as the more imaginative feared, had the forest itself acted as a predator, swallowing them whole? Each theory, however wild, became part of the growing narrative, blending fear with fascination. Local historians added another layer. They examined old town records and newspaper archives, uncovering previous instances of unexplained vanishings in and around Brookhaven. While none matched the scale of the Carter disappearance, the pattern was enough to frighten and intrigue the townspeople. A story from 50 years earlier told of a lone hiker who walked into the same forest and was never seen again. Another recounted a series of children who had vanished near the creek during a heavy storm. The connection between these events and the Carter family's disappearance became a point of anxious speculation. Psychologists and sociologists later noted the way the event rippled through the town. People who had never entered the forest now refused to walk near its edges. Even casual joggers changed their routes, wary of the mist and shadows. Children were kept indoors, and community gatherings moved away from the park entirely. Rumors became a form of social control, fear preserving safety, yet feeding anxiety in equal measure. By the second month after the disappearance, a group of amateur investigators arrived in Brookhaven, drawn by media coverage and the growing legend. They brought maps, night vision cameras, and equipment for long-range surveillance. Some locals welcomed the attention, hoping for breakthroughs. Others resented the intrusion, worried it would stir up the forest's secrets. The investigators claimed to detect anomalies, heat signatures that appeared and vanished, sound recordings capturing low murmurs in the mist, but nothing could be verified independently. Each night, the forest seemed to reject scrutiny, retreating deeper into silence and fog. In the absence of closure, legends hardened. The forest, it was said, could manipulate perception. Trails shifted, sounds deceived, and time itself seemed fluid. Some whispered that the mist was alive, that it could guide or trap, that it had claimed the Carters as it had claimed others before them. These stories, half remembered and half invented, became part of Brookhaven's identity. A place once defined by safety and simplicity now carried a shadow of unease, an acknowledgement that nature, and perhaps something beyond nature, held power the town could not comprehend. Yet, amidst the fear and fascination, a few held on to reason. Detectives, journalists, and neighbors insisted on pursuing evidence, documenting sightings, retracing steps, and cataloging items left behind. Every rumor was examined, cross-referenced, and tested against reality. But the forest offered only ambiguity, leaving every theory plausible and impossible in equal measure. By the end of the third month, the disappearance had transformed into legend. Brookhaven became a town of questions, a place where stories of lost families and shifting forests were told in whispers and at the edge of campfires. The Carter family's fate remained unknown, each rumor carrying fragments of truth, fear, and imagination. For some, the story was a warning; for others, a mystery to be solved. For all, it was a shadow stretching over the town, a reminder that the world could hold secrets the mind might never fully understand. And so the legend grew. The forest, ever silent and patient, waited. It waited for searchers, for curious neighbors, for those who would dare to enter, and for the inevitable questions. What really happened? Who or what was watching from the mist? And would the truth ever emerge from the shadowed trees where reality and imagination blurred into one? It had been over 3 years since the disappearance of Michael Carter, Anna, and their children. Brookhaven had tried to move on, but the forest at the town's edge remained a scar on the community's collective memory. Parents still warned their children to stay away from its shadowed paths. Hikers spoke in hushed tones about the fog, and the stories, both rational and fantastical, persisted in conversations at diners, schools, and town meetings. Life in Brookhaven had resumed, but it had not healed. Then, on a cool spring afternoon, something happened that would reignite fear and speculation. A group of teenagers had been exploring the deeper woods near the creek, a place officially marked as off-limits. Among them was 17-year-old Jason Bell, a local who loved hiking and urban legends alike. They had wandered far beyond the usual trails, cameras in hand, eager to capture photographs of wildlife and misty landscapes. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet, even for the season. As the group rounded a bend in the trail, Jason noticed something unusual. A small clearing partially hidden by undergrowth, overgrown with weeds, and almost invisible unless one approached carefully. At the center of the clearing, half buried in mud and fallen leaves, was an old, dilapidated shack. Its wood was blackened and rotting, with jagged holes in the walls and roof. A faint metallic glint caught Jason's eye near the entrance. Curiosity overtook caution. "Guys, look at this," he whispered, pointing toward the shack. The others approached, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Inside, the shack was small and claustrophobic. Broken furniture, rotted boxes, and layers of dust suggested it had been abandoned for decades. Yet, amidst the decay, there were signs of something more recent. Footprints in the damp soil leading to and from the doorway, a piece of fabric that looked like it had been torn from a jacket, and, most unsettling, a small backpack, remarkably intact considering its surroundings. Jason's heart raced. The backpack looked familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. He unzipped it carefully, revealing its contents: a collection of worn toys, a notebook, and several small personal items. One of the notebooks had a cover with the faint, childish scribble of a name: Sophie Carter. His hands trembled as he leafed through it. Pages were filled with childish drawings, some depicting a forest much like the one surrounding them now, others showing stick figures in peril, small houses, and shadows looming over families. The discovery sent shockwaves through the group. They debated whether to call the authorities immediately or continue searching for additional clues. Jason insisted on calling, and soon the Brookhaven Police Department dispatched officers along with volunteers and forensic experts. The news spread rapidly through the town. The Carter family's belongings, long presumed lost or destroyed, had been found in a remote shack hidden deep in the forest. Investigators approached the shack with caution. The mud and vegetation around the clearing suggested that the location had been deliberately concealed, overgrown, and forgotten by time. Footprints were measured and documented, showing a mixture of adult and child sizes. There were also markings etched into the wood, strange symbols, sharp and precise, reminiscent of some arcane language or ritual. Specialists from outside the county were brought in to examine the symbols, photographs taken for further analysis. The backpack and its contents were catalogued meticulously. Among the items were photographs, now faded, depicting the forest at various times of day, some showing what appeared to be shadowed figures watching from the tree line. Another notebook, belonging to Daniel Carter, contained drawings of a family running through the woods, with towering figures in the background and ominous clouds overhead. Experts noted that the drawings, while naive, showed a detailed awareness of the forest's geography, suggesting the children had spent significant time navigating it. But the most unsettling discovery was a small, tattered journal believed to belong to Michael Carter. Its pages were smeared with mud and water damage, but legible passages described encounters with unidentifiable figures, strange sounds in the mist, and the family's desperate attempts to find a road or signal for help. One entry ended abruptly. "We are not alone. The mist, it moves, keeps us trapped, must stay." The final pages were torn, leaving investigators and townspeople alike with a chilling sense of unfinished horror. The discovery reignited public debate. Local historians recalled the previous disappearances that Mrs. Callahan had mentioned, now seeming connected in a way they could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The shack, hidden and almost forgotten, was analyzed for structural age, showing a mixture of old and newer materials, suggesting it had been adapted over time to conceal its contents. Forensic teams searched for DNA, fingerprints, and any trace of the missing family. While the items confirmed the Carters had been present in the forest for an extended period, there were still no human remains. Speculation escalated. Was the forest some kind of trap, manipulating its trails and fog to isolate victims? Had someone been watching the family all along, using the shack as a holding place? Or was there something more sinister, something inexplicable in nature, guiding events beyond human comprehension? News crews arrived, broadcasting images of the shack, the backpacks, and the children's drawings. Social media exploded, bringing attention from paranormal enthusiasts, skeptics, and true crime followers alike. Residents of Brookhaven felt the old fear return, mingled now with curiosity and dread. Hikers avoided the area even more, parents reinforced warnings to children, and local schools held discussions about safety and the town's history. Psychologists warned against the rise of hysteria, but even rational explanations could not erase the unsettling nature of the discovery. The forest had become a locus of unanswered questions, its shadows now etched into the collective consciousness of the town. Even more perplexing was the lack of human remains. The artifacts confirmed that the Carters had been in the shack, alive and present. Yet where they had gone, how they had vanished, remained a mystery. Some theorized that they had attempted to escape, lost their way, or been abducted. Others leaned toward the supernatural. Perhaps the forest itself had claimed them, the mist and shadows acting as a sentient barrier. In the following weeks, investigators combed the surrounding area, uncovering additional traces. Torn clothing, footprints that ended abruptly, and more symbols carved into trees. Satellite imagery, reviewed in hindsight, suggested that the clearing had been obscured from above for years, hidden by dense foliage. Every piece of evidence deepened the mystery, providing tantalizing clues while withholding any definitive answer. By the end of the investigation's initial phase, one thing was clear. Brookhaven's story was far from over. The forest, the mist, and the hidden shack had provided proof that the Carters' disappearance was neither a random accident nor a simple tragedy. Something deliberate, calculated, or inexplicably intelligent had orchestrated the events, leaving the town, the investigators, and the world to ponder what had truly happened. The discovery, shocking as it was only the beginning. Brookhaven had finally caught a glimpse of the truth, but it was a fragment, a piece of a puzzle that stretched far beyond what anyone could see. The forest waited, patient and silent, holding its secrets tightly in the shadows, daring anyone to seek answers. The discovery of the shack and the belongings of the Carter family had reignited the investigation. But what the town of Brookhaven truly needed was understanding, an attempt to reconstruct the night that had claimed the family and left so many questions unanswered. Forensic analysts, psychologists, and investigators pored over every scrap of evidence, every footprint, every torn page, determined to trace the path of events that had led to their disappearance. The first step was the backpack and its contents. The children's notebooks were examined line by line, revealing not only innocent sketches but a progressive awareness of danger. Daniel's drawings depicted the forest as a labyrinth, the trails twisting unnaturally, turning familiar landmarks into sinister obstacles. In the later pages, the stick figure family was drawn smaller, surrounded by dark, looming figures. It suggested a gradual increase in fear, a growing sense of being pursued. Sophie's notebook corroborated this. Her childlike handwriting described shadows following us, and the mist moves and hides them. Investigators realized that the children had been documenting their ordeal, perhaps as a coping mechanism, unknowingly leaving a diary of terror. Michael Carter's journal became the centerpiece of the reconstruction. Every entry was analyzed for handwriting consistency, ink type, and water damage patterns. Experts concluded that several entries had been written under extreme duress. One page, smeared and torn, described an initial sense of foreboding. "The fog is thicker tonight. I can't see past the creek. The path curves, but it's wrong. Trees, they're moving. Or maybe I am." Analysts noted the almost hallucinatory quality of the text, suggesting both physical exhaustion and psychological stress. By piecing together the entries chronologically, investigators began to map the family's movements. They left their campsite in the early hours, intending to follow familiar trails toward the main road. The journal indicated that they quickly realized the trails were no longer recognizable. Fog, mud, and fallen branches transformed the familiar into the alien. Michael wrote, "We keep turning in circles. Every step leads us deeper into the forest. Anna and the children are scared. I try to stay calm, but even I am lost." The first disappearance, the youngest child, was documented in both Michael's and Sophie's notes. Michael's entry read, "Sophie slipped. I turned. She's gone. I can't hear her. The mist, it swallows her scream." Forensic psychologists interpreted this as the moment when the forest or its unseen presence asserted itself. The abruptness of her disappearance and the lack of any trace suggested that external forces had intervened, whether human, environmental, or something unexplainable. Investigators also found evidence that the family had attempted to create markers to navigate the shifting terrain. Small sticks broken into rudimentary arrows, scratched symbols on trees, and improvised trail markers indicated desperation. Michael's journal described them. "We leave marks, hoping we can find the way back. But the forest, it erases them. Every time we look again, nothing is the same." The repeated observation that landmarks had changed suggested either extreme environmental distortion or psychological perception altered by fear, exhaustion, and stress. One of the most puzzling aspects of the reconstruction was the appearance of the footprints near the shack. Analysts determined they were of adult and child sizes, consistent with the family, but there were also larger prints, deeper and wider, that did not match any known species or human dimensions. They appeared to be deliberate, moving toward the forest interior and then back toward the trails where the family had been. Experts debated. Were these made by an assailant, a predator, or a force that remained unidentifiable? The pattern implied strategic placement, as if someone or something was herding the family deeper into danger. Forensic teams cross-referenced the journal entries with environmental data from the night of the disappearance. Rain had begun around 2 a.m., the creek was rising, and winds had shifted, causing branches to fall unpredictably. The combination of weather, topography, and psychological stress explained some of the family's disorientation, but it could not account for the supernatural elements noted in the notebooks, the moving shadows, the unseen voices, the consistent sensation of being followed. Witness statements were also incorporated. Local hikers recalled hearing muffled cries or fleeting noises during that night, dismissed at the time as animals. Analysts now correlated these reports with entries in the journals, suggesting that the family's distress signals might have been faintly perceptible outside the forest, supporting the idea that they had been isolated but not entirely silent. The reconstructed timeline was harrowing. 11:30 p.m. Family leaves the campsite, intending to reach the main road. 11:45 p.m. Michael observes the first abnormality. Fog thickens unnaturally. Trails seem to twist. 12:05 a.m. Daniel reports seeing a figure in the distance. Shadows loom near the trees. 12:15 a.m. Sophie disappears. Michael notes he turned and she vanished instantly. 12:21 a.m. Family struggles through mud, attempts trail markers. Footsteps of unknown origin appear. 1:05 a.m. Journal entry describes muffled voices and unnatural movement of the mist. 1:15 a.m. Family reaches clearing near creek. Evidence of footprints. Torn backpack noted. 1:32 a.m. Last coherent entries. Michael describes a void closing in, inability to call for help, complete disorientation. Investigators could only speculate about what happened after that. The torn pages and abrupt end of the journal suggested a sudden, catastrophic event. Some theorized that the family attempted to escape across the swollen creek and were swept away. Others argued that the forest or its unseen forces intervened in a way beyond natural explanation. Psychologists noted that the family's terror escalated in patterns consistent with predation, isolation, and extreme fear. Brookhaven's residents were shown diagrams of the reconstructed trail, photographs of the shack, and illustrations from the children's notebooks. The visuals painted a chilling picture, a family navigating a forest that had transformed into a trap, each step eroding safety and sanity. Town meetings erupted with debate over safety, the possibility of supernatural influence, and whether the forest itself could be a sentient predator. Despite all the reconstruction, one key question remained unanswered. What was the nature of the force that claimed the Carters? Every piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, yet no human perpetrator was identified, and the missing family had left no trail beyond the artifacts in the shack. The combination of environmental hazards, psychological terror, and unknown entities left the case suspended between reality and the unexplainable. For investigators, the process of reconstruction was as much about preserving memory as seeking truth. By aligning entries, artifacts, and physical evidence, they could at least understand the sequence of events, the terror, the disappearances, the isolation. But the ultimate cause, the final moments, remained a void. Brookhaven had glimpsed the story of that night. Through journals, drawings, and footprints, they could feel the fear, the disorientation, and the relentless pursuit that the family had endured. Yet, as the town digested the reconstructed events, the haunting realization remained. The forest, the mist, and the unseen force had maintained its secrets. The puzzle was partially solved, but the final picture, the fate of Michael, Anna, Sophie, and Daniel, remained shrouded in shadow. The reconstruction, painstaking as it was, offered clarity and horror in equal measure. It showed the sequence, the struggle, and the terror, but it could not answer the one question everyone wanted to know. Why? Why had the Carters vanished so completely? And, more pressingly, could the forest claim again? Brookhaven knew one thing for certain. The past was not past. The forest was patient, and the story of that night was far from over. Years had passed since the Carters' disappearance, yet Brookhaven remained haunted by the memory of that foggy, rain-soaked night. The discovery of the abandoned shack and the family's belongings had offered partial insight, but no official closure. For the townspeople, every whisper of the forest was tinged with fear, and every traveler who ventured near it felt the weight of unseen eyes watching. The final investigation, led by a coalition of local authorities and federal experts, produced a comprehensive report. It catalogued the physical evidence, the footprints of unknown origin, the scattered belongings, the torn journals, and the children's meticulously detailed notebooks. It outlined the environmental factors, including the sudden storm, swollen creek, and shifting trails. Expert testimony suggested that the family had likely experienced extreme disorientation and fear, compounded by environmental hazards. Yet even with this analysis, the report could not conclusively determine the final fate of Michael, Anna, Sophie, or Daniel. The forest had kept its secrets. In the aftermath, Brookhaven's residents struggled to reconcile with the tragedy. Memorials were erected near the edge of the forest, a simple wooden plaque engraved with the names of the Carters, accompanied by small stones and candles left by mourners. Families came to pay their respects, leaving flowers and notes, some written by children who had read Sophie's drawings and felt the terror she had experienced. The memorials were a way for the town to acknowledge loss, to confront the incomprehensible, and to maintain the memory of a family taken too soon. Relatives of the Carters were left to navigate the unending void of grief. Michael's sister, Laura, spoke at a town meeting, her voice trembling but resolute. "We will never stop searching," she said. "Even if the world says they are gone, we hold on to their memory. We honor them by remembering what they loved, by holding close what they cherished. We cannot give them back, but we can carry their story forward." Her words resonated with many, a mixture of sorrow and defiance, a refusal to let despair dominate. Psychologists were brought in to speak with the townspeople, helping them process collective trauma. Children who had grown up hearing stories of the forest were given counseling to separate imagination from reality, to cope with fear that had been passed down like an inheritance. Adults wrestled with guilt and helplessness, wondering if more could have been done, whether the disappearance could have been prevented. The emotional landscape of Brookhaven became a patchwork of mourning, resilience, and quiet dread. The press followed every development closely. National and local news outlets published features analyzing the forest's history, interviewing those who had explored its depths, and speculating on the mysterious forces that might reside within. Documentaries recounted the Carters' journey, reconstructing their movements through the forest based on journals, footprints, and witness accounts. Experts debated the plausibility of natural hazards versus malevolent, possibly supernatural intervention. Each broadcast reignited public fascination, but also fear. The forest had become a character in its own right, a sentient landscape capable of consuming lives without leaving a trace. Despite the widespread coverage and official reports, unanswered questions remained. Could the family have survived somewhere, hidden from sight? Were the footprints evidence of a human perpetrator or something else entirely? Were there other instances of disappearances in the forest's history, quietly erased from public memory? Brookhaven had no definitive answers, only fragmented pieces of truth stitched together into a narrative that was as unsettling as it was incomplete. Over time, the community implemented safety measures. Trails were marked clearly, signage warned travelers of sudden weather changes, and local guides were trained in emergency response. Yet the forest itself retained an aura of malevolence. Even scientists who had studied the area admitted that the landscape was anomalous, with trails that seemed to shift and mists that defied standard meteorological explanations. Some hypothesized that the forest's geography combined with psychological stress could explain the disappearances, but for many this rationalization felt hollow. Emotionally, the town oscillated between acceptance and lingering dread. Annual vigils commemorated the Carters, blending ritual and remembrance. Children were taught caution and respect for nature, stories of the family serving as a cautionary tale. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the forest, aware that curiosity and tragedy were tightly intertwined, and that the boundary between safety and danger could be perilously thin. The Carters' disappearance left a lasting imprint on Brookhaven's culture. Artists painted the forest's fog-drenched trails, writers published suspenseful retellings, and local historians cataloged every documented oddity. The story became folklore, part of the town's identity. Yet behind the artistry and legend lay raw, unhealed grief. Parents worried for their children, hikers hesitated at the forest's edge, and even law enforcement officers regarded the area with unease. The past was present in every rustling leaf and drifting fog. Ultimately, the official resolution was both definitive and inconclusive. Authorities closed the formal investigation, citing environmental hazards and the lack of concrete evidence. The report acknowledged the high likelihood of disorientation, accidents, and exposure leading to the family's disappearance. Yet it also admitted the persistence of unexplained phenomena, footprints of unknown origin, sudden shifts in terrain, and the eerie consistency of the journal's warnings about shadows and mist. Officially, the case was closed, but unofficially it remained an open wound. For the Carters' relatives, closure was personal rather than procedural. They visited the forest edge, whispered the family's names, and left small tokens, drawings, notes, toys. These acts of remembrance created a bridge between the lost and the living, a fragile attempt to reconcile with the unknown. Community members who had been involved in the search or investigation carried these memories forward, becoming stewards of the story, ensuring it would not be forgotten. Even as life resumed, the forest's shadow lingered. Travelers reported fleeting shadows, inexplicable noises, and sudden, unnerving mists that seemed almost alive. The mystery of the Carters became emblematic of nature's power and human vulnerability. It reminded the town and the world that despite knowledge, preparation, and courage, there are forces that defy understanding. In the end, Brookhaven's narrative held both resolution and ambiguity. The sequence of events had been reconstructed, the terror understood in fragments, and the family's suffering acknowledged. Yet the final cause, the ultimate fate of Michael, Anna, Sophie, and Daniel, remained obscured, a truth veiled by fog, forest, and silence. The story concluded with a moral undertone, caution, respect, and the limits of human comprehension. And so the tale of the Carters ended where it had begun, at the edge of the forest, shrouded in mist, whispering of fear and absence, leaving behind questions that no one could fully answer. The forest had claimed its story, and some shadows were never meant to be illuminated. Brookhaven moved forward, but the night of rain, mist, and disappearance remained, lingering in memory, ever present and infinitely unresolved.